Has Charles Leclerc and Lando Norris made a mistake by both signing long-term deals with their current respected teams in Ferrari and McLaren? Welcome to Nailing the Apex. I'm Tim Hauraney, and pleased to be joined to discuss this and a few other little bits along the way from ESPN F1. It's Nate Saunders. What's happening, dude? How are you?
Hey, man. Yeah, I'm good. Always a pleasure when we talk. And I think first appearance for a little while. I can't remember when I did it last year, but yeah, always love having a chat.
Yeah, it has been a while, actually. We didn't even get to talk about like my experience in Hell's Kitchen in Vegas, eating steak and then having issues, and yeah, we didn't get to talk about any of that stuff. And we don't need to now, but it's been a while.
That's one for when we see each other in person. That's the great thing about Formula One. There are some stories that are the beginning of a podcast story, and there are some that just remain between friends.
That's right.
In the setting of a media center, there's plenty of those. I still feel like because I went away after Vegas. So Vegas was my last race of the year. I did Vegas, and then I went to see some friends in Tampa. And obviously, the majority of people in Formula One went on to Abu Dhabi from that point. So I kind of feel like I've got a lot of Vegas catching up to do with people.
Oh yeah.
Because of that, because then for me, it kind of I went into my winter break then everyone else did. So I've caught up with a few people back in the UK. But yeah, in terms of just hearing how everyone got on, I think my question would be, well, how was your winter and how was Vegas 6 months ago now, or whatever it'll be by that point?
So I think so. I mean,
it'll be like 4 or 5. Yeah, four probably.
I would think so. Like it ended. What was it? Mid-November? Was it? It was mid-November.
Mid-November,
right?
Yeah. So actually, yeah, it'll be coming up to 4, won't it? Because we'll be end of February in Bahrain.
Yes. Yeah. And I was going to ask you: are you going to go to New York next week for the Williams thing?
No, sadly not. We were planning to, but we just looked at the season, and I think we're going to just save budget for the year itself. But some cool events there, Williams, and then some other bits happening during the week, which I'm not. I just can't remember if the other one I'm thinking of has been confirmed publicly or not. I don't know if it's one that we know about, but people don't. Either way, there's a cool event coming next week as well as the Williams event, which I think is public. If it's not public, you heard it here first. Williams. Yeah, no, it is. I think they're doing it, obviously, with Logan there. It makes sense, right, to capitalize on New York a little bit.
Yeah.
Are you going to be there?
I'm going to be there. Yeah,
Nice.
It's going to... it's Williams invited, sent out the invite like you got, like we all got. And I was like, yeah, for sure, I can make that happen. It's going to be a lot of fun.
I mean, I initially very enthusiastically was like, yeah, I'll be there. See you then. Don't ask me about it again. I'll be there. Don't worry. All good. And then, we chatted about it internally, and it was like, I can't go. So I was like, guys, I'm sorry, I can't make it. And I was quite upset about it because I was like, I love New York as well. New York's just a great city to go to.
Oh, it's incredible.
And I like it when teams lean into their launches a bit better.
Yeah.
Or I say a bit better when they put a bit of effort in. I mean, there's reasons why they can't always do it, but it's nice when there's a feel, there's something to it. Red Bull last year took us to New York for the launch of their car.
Yep.
And that was when they announced Ford and everything like that. And that was, I mean, the event itself was a bit chaotic, but, the feel of it being in America, especially with where F1 is right now as well, that was pretty cool, in terms of the boom in America.
Yeah, that was an incredible event. It was really cool how big they blew it up too. I was really excited to watch that.
It was freezing. I mean, it was so cold. I don't know what the weather's like in New York right now, but I think my bones have only just recovered from how cold it was that week. And I'm a British guy, so I should be used to the cold. But the cold we have here is so different to the cold you guys have in North America, just generally. It's like it's just a whole different level. We just have miserable rain here. When New York, it was, I don't know what the temperature was because it's all in Fahrenheit and but it was cold. It was freezing.
I think like a big part of it's the wind, man. Like
but that was a huge thing.
Like the wind for me kills me. I'm not a weatherman, and I'm not going to be here and sitting here talking about weather, but like it's the wind, dude. The wind kills me. But
I'd pay to see you do a weather broadcast before a race, with the green screen. And you're like, there's some moisture coming up, like on Groundhog Day when he's like, there's moisture coming up from the south. That'd be great. Everyone should have to walk past that when they go into the paddock.
It'd be I'd be his laughing stock. I'd do
it.
If you own
it,
I'd do it. I would do it for sure, 100%. I would do it. I'd do it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Within reason, obviously. Okay, so let's talk about Ferrari first. I mean, last week, Charles Leclerc, inking a long-term deal with Ferrari. the length in his words were several years. So
Yeah.
his deal
pretty
was
vague.
his deal was originally set to end at the end of 2024. So at the end of this season. Now we'll start there. And if we go back to 2023, Ferrari, it was a tough season. I mean, I think the start of 2023, it was a disaster for the team. They're just very uncompetitive. There was a dramatic sort of reshuffling behind the scenes, and you had Matteo Binotto, who was out as team principal, and then in comes Frederic Vasseur. And, with the new team principal comes new changes, new philosophies, and how to manage and run a race team. Then they had this complete overhaul of their aerodynamic philosophy when they got to Spain. And that took time to learn. And Sainz, the only driver to score a win all season in Singapore. And he actually led Leclerc for most of the Drivers' Championship until the end of it, where Leclerc just beat him by, I think it was about 6 points, if I remember correctly.
It was close, wasn't it, right at the end?
Yeah, it was extremely close by the two of them. But then as the season started to draw to a close, I mean, you could kind of see that Ferrari was starting to understand their car a little bit more and starting to find their way a little bit. Now, Leclerc is like extremely talented driver, but I just wonder that if signing a deal with Ferrari that is for, quote, several years, you've really you've shot yourself in the foot, in my opinion, with a potential move elsewhere once the new engine regulations come into play in 2026. Now, granted, we don't know how competitive Ferrari is going to be this season or 2025, but we also really don't know just how competitive they will be in 2026 with a new set of regulations. And I think that's the mistake for Leclerc. I think you ride out your current deal. You see what's out there. You see what's happening in that driver space. And then I think you do like a 1 and a 1, like you do a 1 plus an option. And then you go into 26 and you see what happens. That's where I think he's really shot himself in the foot, Nate.
Yeah, and it is. It's difficult to know exactly how long that deal is. The Italian press was suggesting it was through to 29, weren't they? Saying it was kind of a 5-year deal, which is even longer than Max's deal, which is to 28. Yeah. So that would be taking it basically to the end of the decade, which would be pretty remarkable. You're right. I mean, to tie yourself down for that long, I'd be really surprised if those options you mentioned don't exist in this contract. I feel like, this kind of deal now. I think drivers and teams both like to put options in just as a safeguard for themselves. A few years ago, when Ricciardo left McLaren, I spoke to Zach Brown not long after that, and he said his biggest regret that whole saga had taught him he has to have exit clauses on his side, because he basically had to pay Ricciardo out fully for those 2 years. Well, that year that he basically gave up on his contract. Some of these options have performance clauses in them, etc., and stuff like that, both for the team and for the driver. If the team isn't able to win a race, I can leave. I think that's what helped Vettel leave Red Bull in 2014. If I haven't won by, summer break, I can get out and go and talk to Ferrari, as he did, and as he ended up actually making that switch. So I think Leclerc's deal will be pretty complicated, pretty complex to it for that reason. But you're right, it's a strange one because, I mean, it is a strange one in the sense of the length of it and the fact that it does just mean it's Ferrari or bust for Charles Leclerc for that time. If you don't win the championship there, you might not be able to get out of it. You might, as you say, be stuck at a team that in 2026 might, any of the teams could do this. It's not just Ferrari, but you could be a team that really makes the wrong step somewhere in the next 2 years, developing that, that whole new, the new engine, etc., the new car, and then boom, you're stuck there. So I think he must have something in his contract that means he can get out at the end of 26. So I think 26 is going to be such a fascinating year for the contracts, because every driver by then is going to know which team you want to be at, and that team is almost going to have a pick of drivers, I think, who are either trying to maneuver their way out of deals or have the option to get out of deals and say, I want to come race for you. Now, it might end up being Red Bull, who dominate again in 26. And then if you're Leclerc, I think your argument as a counterpoint to it being a mistake would be, well, I'm tying myself down with one of the biggest teams on the grid. If there's any team that can get this next set of regs right, why not Ferrari? I know that we're used to Ferrari not being that team, in the last 15 years, but Charles been there for a while now. And I think there's two things at play here. I think the first one is, you're right, all those changes that were made, we started to see that, I think, there were positive changes, there were positive noises coming out of Ferrari that maybe we hadn't heard in previous years. So he if you're Leclerc, you're probably looking at it thinking, okay, well, actually, we aren't making the same mistakes that we were making. Inaki Rauda, who was the old strategy head, left as well. Whole new strategy team. And Ferrari last year, to their credit, their strategy calls seem to be more on point. There are a few things they got wrong, but in 22, it had been every single race. There was just call after call. It was like, what are they doing? And that seems slightly less of a case last year. I think there were still a few where they're always a bit of a head scratching team, aren't they? But I feel like that turned the corner. So I think that's one thing. But secondly, as well, and I think it's and I'll stop talking in a sec because I've just been talking at you for for 5 minutes. I think as Formula One fans and as Formula One media, we can really overlook the pull and the allure of that narrative and that storyline of being the first Ferrari driver to win since 2007.
That's a good point.
I think that's big for any driver, but if you're Charles as well and you've been there, I forget the year exactly they signed him to the driver program, but he was a teenager when they did that. He's been in Ferrari for as long as he can remember. They've got him to this point. They brought him into Formula 3, they brought him into Formula 2, they brought him into Formula 1. And so I think that the idea of being that guy, it would be difficult not to be romantic about that idea. And I think if you were to say to Charles Leclerc, where do you want to win this championship? I think he would say Ferrari. Not to say he wouldn't value a championship anywhere. Of course he would. But I think that you add that in, and if Ferrari especially have turned to him and say it's a long deal, or we start looking elsewhere for a guy that we kind of build around, you're like, all right, I'll take the long deal then. Like, let's do this together. There's kind of shades of Schumacher there, committing for a long time and finally getting the reward of it. After all those those missed attempts, those disappointing years in the late 90s. So I think there's a bit of that in play as well. And Charles, when you talk to him, you can, it's clear as day from the moment he starts talking how much he loves Ferrari and, everything it stands for. So I think that has probably played on that decision quite a bit. And yeah, he seems happy for a guy that hasn't won a ton of races lately. He seems pretty happy there, doesn't he? He's not like a driver that, I know sometimes people say, oh, he needs to get out of Ferrari, but I feel like a lot of his frustration with that situation is, yes, this is stopping me from winning, but he's also upset that Ferrari can't get it right because he's like, I want to win, and I want to win with Ferrari as well. So I think there's a lot going on there. But yeah, to your point, the clauses in it, or the clauses that aren't in it, as it may turn out, will be the really interesting thing to get into down the line, because there may be a situation where Charles like, I need to get out of here finally. He might have to kind of tear those heartstrings out and say, right, I've got to go win somewhere else. So we're not quite there yet, but I feel like another couple of years of Ferrari just not really delivering for him, and I think that mindset will change for him eventually.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think, one of the things being, the management structure behind the scenes. And I think, you made a good point with 2022. And I mean, obviously strategy, really killed them a lot that season as well. And, there were moments within that season that I think Leclerc actually had a shot at really, really competing for that championship.
Yeah, same.
However, the team just falling apart. But I think also from the executive level down, if you go to big Ferrari, it's kind of like, I think there's just too much meddling from the executive power coming into the team. And I think one of the big things for Leclerc that sort of allows him to make this decision and separates those two divisions from the Scuderia to, the big Ferrari, it's having Mattia Binotto let go, and then you bring in Fred Vasseur, and now Vasseur he's just a racing guy, right? Like that's what he is. He's been involved in racing for so long that a lot of the other crap he just doesn't really allow to kind of seep into a lot of his teams that he's worked for or been a team principal of. And I think Leclerc just being frustrated with Binotto and maybe that management structure. And then we saw that turnover where, Ferrari lets him go, and, then in comes Fred Vasseur. And I think their relationship, those two, is solid, right? With Vasseur and Leclerc. And I think,
and it goes
I
back
think if
to,
it's not for Frederick Vasseur, Yeah, it goes back a long way,
Yeah,
man. It goes back to
especially
I want
juniors.
to say junior formula days, right?
Yeah, I think so because I think I
Yeah.
think Vasseur obviously a lot of his career was he cut his teeth basically in the junior formula. Like he worked with Lewis and all those guys. So yeah, I think he and Charles had a pretty strong bond going all that way back.
I think if it's not for Frederick Vasseur coming in and being at this team, I I really don't see a long-term deal like actually getting done with Charles Leclerc.
Yeah, I think honestly, I think the Vasseur factor is probably huge in this, and also I think that beyond the relationship that the two may or may not, I think you're right. I think that is there, and Leclerc looked at that and was like, that's a good appointment. We haven't just promoted someone from within Ferrari, which Ferrari kind of got in the habit of doing after Domenicali. It was Mattiacci, Arriva Bene, and then obviously Binotto, all came from different parts of Ferrari or like the Agnelli business, but they were all kind of internal. They all felt like, oh, they've just promoted from within. This is kind of a Ferrari stooge, if you want to call it that. Vasseur's come in from the outside and he's kind of said, look, I respect this team, I respect its institutions, but we've got to get a handle on the things we're not doing well. And I think he's just given it a much calmer feel, I think, this year. Because he's kind of like that, isn't he? He's quite. I mean, I always find it very difficult to transcribe his English media sessions because he kind of talks in a kind of a mumble and a grumble a little. Because that's not his first language, so it's not me. It's not me criticizing him because I can't speak a second language very well at all. So I totally understand. But I think the aura around him, the way he goes about doing things is a lot different to Binotto, and to be honest, probably different to how those other guys I mentioned, Arriva Bene, Mattiacci, and probably even Domenicali to a degree when he was boss there. So not that Leclerc worked with those guys, but just in terms of the culture of the team. So I think you're right. Mm-hmm. I think that would have played a huge role in that deal and the length of the deal.
Which then, Nate, it really leads us on to, what do they do with Carlos Sainz? I mean, he, from the sounds of things, he's been really lobbying for a longer term deal at Ferrari. So instead of having like a 1 year plus an option, it sounds like he wants something like a 2 year plus an option, maybe even a little bit longer than that. But then on the other side of it, for Sainz, there's rumors that Sauber is interested in trying to snap him up for when Audi comes into F1. But what do they do with Carlos Sainz? Because I don't know. Like, if you're just going to sign him up for a 1 year, then why even bother? Like,
well, I think with Sainz they know what they've got, and they've got a very good driver. And like you mentioned at the top of the episode, only driver to win a race that wasn't Red Bull. Last season, and in that race, had that really smart drive where he used Lando to kind of keep the Mercedes guys at bay, if you remember that. So I think keeping Sainz there is a great option. You've got a really reliable second driver. I don't mean second driver in the old conventional sense of Schumacher, Barrichello. I mean your second guy that across from Charles. But I totally understand his frustration because I think Ferrari do see him as a guy that they can just kind of keep around while Charles there at the team. And if you think back to Carlos's earlier career, I mean, we heard it from the moment he got free of the Red Bull program. He hated the fact that he was always on kind of these 1 year deals. He'd get like a deal here, and he always would lobby for, I want 2 year deal so that I don't have to sit there, in that season. And Bottas was the same. Bottas used to just get year deal after year deal after year deal. And the impact that had at him at Mercedes was awful. He hated it because it's like you get to race 4, 5, and people are already asking you, what are you doing next year? So I don't think Carlos will get a 1 year deal, but I think that's why he naturally just prefers a longer deal as well. But I really do think the Audi option for him is a really strong one. You've got Andreas Seidel there. They obviously work together at McLaren. And I do get the sense with Sainz, and I think that you get this sense from watching the team, but you also get the same sense when you talk to people around him. I don't think he can ever truly compete for a championship at Ferrari because I think if that situation were to emerge, I think Leclerc is probably the better driver of the two. I think that's a fair thing to say, but definitely the better qualifier. I think Leclerc's the best qualifier in Formula One.
Yes.
Yep. So I don't know. I think in terms of talent, he might not quite be in the same place, but even if he was, I think the team in that instance would just kind of naturally rally around Leclerc, just given the way they feel about him and given the fact that he is kind of the face of the team. So I think with that in mind, if you're Sainz, you look at Audi coming in with Sauber in 26, and you say, I can be the face of that team instead. I can be the guy that goes there, and it's like I don't think he was going to go in and say, I want to be lead driver, treat me like number one, and treat the other guy like garbage. But you can establish yourself in the way that Charles had a 5, 6, 7 year head start at Ferrari to establish himself with that team. So I really think that the Audi deal
100%.
and that's, again, that speaks to why he wants a longer deal, because if Ferrari's willing to give him the same deal as Leclerc, in your head, you're like, okay, they see me on an even keel to him. They see me as the same driver.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact he's not getting that, and the fact that he's, like you say, from everything we're hearing, and I've heard that from a couple of places, he's really pushing for a longer deal than Ferrari really want to give him. Any of us, if that was the same case in any of our jobs, if we said, well, I want this, and your boss, your company turned to you and said, well, actually, we can kind of give you half of that, and there's no guarantees long term, you'd think, okay, it's not great, is it? It doesn't suggest they're full of confidence in me. So yeah, I think, but Ferrari keeping him makes sense because he's solid. Yeah. I'm not sure how many drivers really, maybe an Albon. I think an Albon would be a really interesting choice to maybe replace a Sainz. But also, you've got to really, Sainz and Leclerc got on very well as well. So I don't think Ferrari really need to upset that. But I think in their head, they're definitely probably thinking, well, if we do get a good car, we don't have to have Sainz in it. We have to have Leclerc in it, but we don't have to have Sainz in it. And ultimately, that's a difficult mindset for Carlos to change anytime soon.
Yeah, no, I think you're 100% right with all that. If I'm Sainz as a driver, to have the stability and to have a longer term deal, and I've said this on the show before, I mean, it's very important. I mean, it keeps you very secure. You understand where, your job's going to be. You understand that you have a job for the following year as well. So it helps you just focus on the racing. But I'm just really interested to see kind of how the season coming up plays out for Carlos, because I mean, one of the things that I always notice about him, he's an extremely hard worker. So if he's fallen behind on something, he always finds a way of grinding it out and eventually getting on the same page as the other driver. And he's always been like that. And I respect that greatly because it takes a lot of work to do that. But I think like one of the things for Carlos is just having a good start to the season. Like if you go back to 2022, it was dreadful for him. He had a horrible season and it just didn't get off on the right foot. But if we go back to 2023, Leclerc didn't have the great start to the season, but Sainz actually did. And that kept Sainz within that driver's, championship ahead of Leclerc and kept him pushing and kept him on top of his game way more. And I think that's what he needs at the same time. And I agree with you that, Leclerc is balls to the wall. Like that guy is the fastest over one lap in qualifying. And I just think like Carlos is a great racing driver. Like he's just really great at managing.
He's got that brain for it, hasn't he? That I think actually gets overlooked with him. But I really agree with you. I think his racecraft is actually, I think he's in that top collection of drivers and we haven't had a great chance to see it all that often, but when we have, he's been able to win with it. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah, 100%. And so like, I think it would be smart for Ferrari to hold on to him, even because of his feedback. Also, like I'm like making arguments for why they should be holding on to him, and they probably already know all this. But like hell, I mean, it should be, in my opinion, it should be easier to give him a longer term deal because. Yeah, he's great at pushing the team forward too. And I think if you're going to have two drivers that are going to be good in certain aspects of a race or a race weekend, and they're able to push the team as well. I mean, you got to keep them on the team. And then if you look over at McLaren, I mean, now you've got Lando Norris. His deal wasn't even up this year. I mean, he was locked up till 2025. So now he's extended his contract as well. Yeah. And again, with terms and conditions, we don't really know how long that is. It sounds like it's going to be a while, but for me, like the mistake for Norris is not knowing if this team is really back and headed in the right direction, or if last season's turn in performance was a was a blip on the radar, Nate. I mean, it is a little tough to tell, but I think something in there really convinced him that this was the right team for him to stick with for the foreseeable future. I mean,
Yeah, 100%. And I
it
think
just seems like it was just a smart move, right? Just a smart move by him, I think.
in terms of extending, yeah, I think, and I honestly as well, I think the McLaren have saved themselves a big headache here. I went 2 weeks ago,
Yeah.
2 or 3 weeks ago now, to Woking, to the McLaren headquarters there when they unveiled their livery for the season, and we had some time with Zach Brown and Andrea Stella, and I would say, I mean, I didn't count the questions, but I would say nearly half the questions that both those guys got were kind of about Lando in some way. You know, are you worried Lando's going to leave? Because obviously we've had Red Bull kind of circling for a while. You know, was last year key for Lando? Like, can Lando win? It was so Lando focused, and I think that part of that's because there's a lot of British media there, from the newspapers. So obviously they're there to get a Lando story, but I think really that was the big nagging story in the back of Zach Brown's head. And Lando then did admit to us last week when we spoke to him after this deal that there were doubts in his head at the start of last season, about 12 months ago, when they got to Bahrain, had that awful start. And all of us, it was kind of red flags everywhere. It was like, well, this looks really bad. This looks like a team that's in real trouble. And it almost felt a little bit like McLaren when they first joined Honda, didn't it? We were like, they're so far off the pace. How have they? It was like everyone had kind of made a step forward, and it was like, how have they made a step back this far? And obviously, full credit to, like it looked awful. And his body language of his first couple of races, if I'd made a bet before that Austrian upgrade came in, the one that changed their whole season, I would not have thought Lando signs another deal with McLaren. There's no way on earth he would have done that. But I think that to be honest with you, you can basically copy and paste everything I said about Charles Leclerc and Ferrari and just change Leclerc's name to Norris and change Ferrari to McLaren. Because he's kind of a product of that team. He's been there for a long time. Zach Brown invested in him as a young kid. People are going to be like, this is exactly what he said about Leclerc and Ferrari. But I think that deep down, Lando had wanted to see that progress from McLaren. He's wanted to stay there. He's wanted to sign a long deal. And it was almost like, give me a reason to, because when he signed his last extension, that got really criticized. I think it was 2021, and he extended to this year, didn't he? And I think it was to this year or maybe to 25. And everyone said the same, similar to what you're hearing with this deal. It was, it's too long. You've tied yourself down to a team that's not doing anything, et cetera, et cetera. And I think before he did that again, he was like, I need to see progress. And it wasn't just a car improvement. I think that the whole structure of that team, Zach Brown's done a fantastic job of, first of all, realizing that they had made a mistake with the structure of the team kind of last year, completely almost nuking that and saying, right, we got to start again. Brought Stella in. Obviously, Seidel left. I think Seidel leaving did him a big favor, because I think Seidel kind of walking away when he did, it just allowed him to be like, right, let's hit the reset button here. And Stella's come in, and Stella's had such a positive impact on that team. He's got that energy about him. When you go into the McLaren Media Center, there's just a different feel with him in charge. And I think, and that's not to knock Seidel, because Seidel obviously, has a really good reputation in the paddock. I think it's just a different style that was needed. And I think Lando really likes that. And everybody's kind of working towards this common goal, and they've seen what the end product was last season, and they feel like Red Bull now, they might be far down the road, but I think McLaren now feel like, well, if we make all the right calls this year, we can maybe get them, into 2025. They've obviously got the wind tunnel now as well. So all these things I think have come together at the right point. Lando's seen them, and exactly the same with Leclerc. Like, rather than have all that uncertainty of like, oh, well, what am I going to do at the end of 25? He's tied himself down long term. I imagine he'll be able to get out of it if he really needs to down the line. There's no guarantees of that, of course. But he's tied himself down, and he's basically put his eggs in the basket of, I think McLaren can win the championship. And actually, I think that's potentially a riskier move than Leclerc doing it with Ferrari, because Ferrari are going to build their own engines in 26. McLaren are taking the Mercedes engines. So we've seen that that's not always, in the modern era, that's not always been a recipe for success, being a customer team. It's slightly different, obviously, when Red Bull were doing it with Renault, but it proves you can do it still. But yeah, so I don't know. I think the deal made more sense from the McLaren side, to me than the Norris side, just because, I think with Norris now, he's kind of taken himself out of that conversation for getting himself a better seat if he needs to in 26. Let's say if McLaren's car, under the new regs isn't any good.
I think it's interesting. You made a good point. I mean, like during his media availability there on Friday last week, he did mention that he thinks that wins could be in the cards for them this season. Maybe not a championship, but could have a shot at some legit wins coming up this season. So I went back and I took a look at it and I listened to his media conference, and I think some of the things that convinced him, I think you're bang on with a lot of it. I mean, I think, in my opinion, money obviously is going to be a convincer for
always
sure.
Helpful.
Right? I mean, but yeah, like the wind tunnel you had mentioned, new simulators, what Stella was able to do in just a few months. He was dropped in last minute to run this team. The new hires, I think the engineering structure that they've also sort of built up here, right? Like their technical team of Peter Padromo, and then they were able to go out and get Rob Marshall. He joins from Red Bull, and
Sanchez came in as well.
Time. He'll be, Davis Sanchez from Ferrari as well.
Yeah.
And I think seeing all of that, seeing what Zach was doing, seeing what Andrea was doing, and also on top of all that, sprinkle in that he had the best season he's ever had last year, right? And then I think that's the direction that he's looking at, and he's putting all those pieces together, and he's saying that this should be the team that I stick with moving forward. Because, I mean, if he's able to get wins this upcoming season, then he's done a masterful job at really coming up with a great extension at a team that could be coming back to fight for championships later on down the road.
And also
there was Red Bull talk. Oh, sorry, you go ahead. Yeah.
No, mate, sorry, you go. I'll go after you.
I was going to say, for he had mentioned about the conversations with other teams, and there had been conversations, but they were mostly yeah, but they were mostly like, hey, how are you, kind of conversations.
Yeah, right.
And there had always been that Red Bull talk behind the scenes of could Lando end up being Max Verstappen's teammate? And it was Sky Sports, I believe, he was talking to about that, where he kind of just said it wasn't really something he wanted to do, was be Max Verstappen's teammate. I don't blame
honestly
him. I mean, I wouldn't want to.
Yeah, I mean, the track record for Max's teammates has been pretty bad. Even when he's had Perez now, who's is a really good driver. We all forget he's a really good driver. Ricciardo kind of went off the boil towards the end of that time there, obviously in Gasly and Albon. So I never fully, I'll be honest with you, Tim, I never really bought the idea of Lando going to Red Bull, because Max, as long as Max and Helmut Marko are at the same team, Helmut Marko, his career, really, his crowning achievement of his career is finding Max Verstappen. Dietrich Mateschitz found Vettel, found Ricciardo. Helmut Marko, to his credit, not found Max. It wasn't like he found him around the corner. I was like, there's a driver here that's really good. But he was the one who was like, we've got to give him the seat at Toro Rosso, and he's always kind of hung his hat on that. I got this guy to the team, and I feel like that you can kind of see that at Red Bull, because other drivers come in and Helmut looks at them. It's like, well, I didn't find you, Horner.
Yeah, he's not my guy.
Yeah, exactly. And Helmut Marko still has huge sway at that team, and obviously Max has huge sway within the team, and Christian is massively on board with all things Max. So you go into that setting, and I just realistically, I just don't think you can go and win a championship there. I mean, if you compare it, for example, to the situation at Mercedes when George Russell went there, look how different the feel around Russell is compared to Bottas when Bottas was there. Because Bottas was not an outsider in a negative sense, but he came from outside of the program. He came in and Lewis was established. Russell's gone in there, and obviously he's had Mercedes backing. He knows the program inside out, and he's been much more successful alongside that. And I don't think as a second driver at Red Bull, you can honestly get that unless you are like some prodigious talent like Max coming through. But there isn't one of those on the horizon at the moment, is there? I mean, I know Lawson did okay, and but like I don't think he's going to go in there and be better than Max. So I always felt like the Red Bull stuff, probably from Lando, was in that back pocket of like, okay, look, Red Bull's there, they're interested, and like you said, I don't think they were super serious talks, but the reason they all talk to each other is for leverage, isn't it? It's so they can say, well, look, Ferrari said they can, if I went there for 2 years, they could give me X, Y, Z. So yeah, I think Lando's played that fairly well, and to be honest with you, I think Christian Horner let that story leak out into the media. He wasn't shy about saying, yeah, Lando's talented. We like Lando.
Yeah.
And I think that he enjoys doing that. There were times during the season when Horner was kind of suggesting, oh, I've heard that, is Lewis going to Ferrari? Like, and he'd just say that. And it's like, he's not going to Ferrari, but you enjoy this, this winds Toto up, and saying stuff about Lando is going to wind Zach up. So I think that a lot of that is in play there as well. But yeah, I've just never bought that. And I think that he's made a sensible call there, because also McLaren have extended Piastri, haven't they, until 26 or 27. So, he probably looked at that as well and thought, this kid's
the
good.
Other thing with that one, Nate, is
yeah, right. No, and you're probably about to say the same thing, but like that, I think that's changed the dynamic of that team a little bit. Not saying it's gone away from Lando. I still think Lando's just where they're both at in their career. Lando is the guy right now, but Piastri's so good, and if you suddenly start playing around with your contracts and Zach gets frustrated with you, it's like, all right, fine, Piastri's the guy. Whatever. Like Zach can easily make that call. He can flip it. He can flip a switch and be like, right, Piastri's the guy that we think is going to win the title now, or that is going to be the guy we focus on. So yeah, I think that's a bit of the puzzle as well. That probably may, and like you mentioned, the money probably helped as well and all that stuff. But all those things came together, and it's a good time to sign as well. Start of the year, get out of the way. He's done one set of presses, and he doesn't have to talk about his contract again for a few years. So works out nicely for him.
One of the interesting things that came out from last week, and it's something I've been thinking about over the weekend, and I was texting you about it, but it's like, we're now seeing that these teams have become like franchises, and that's something I never thought I'd ever see in Formula One. I mean, teams being extremely profitable, but we're also seeing like drivers getting like franchise tags, like we see in other professional sports. You've got your franchise player like Patrick Mahomes on the Chiefs, right? And then if then you go and you say, like, here are these teams, and they have a franchise driver, and then the franchise driver is signing these big long-term deals. I mean, you had mentioned off the top, like, perfect example, Verstappen, he isn't up until 2028. And we assume Leclerc is maybe around, 28, 29. Norris probably 26, or could be as long as 28. But I think for me, when I was coming up in racing, and I'd said this before we'd hit record, but you'd be lucky if you got like a 1 year plus an option. And then the higher you went up that ladder, you'd be lucky if you got an option at all. And then same with F1. I remember some of the drivers I knew going race to race in Formula One, like race by race. So I think it's all a sign on, I think, just how important driver stability at teams is now in this era of Formula One. And it's something I think, Nate, like I've never seen anything like this. So it's quite surprising. It just feels like it's so important now that teams build their cars around the drivers, and then they both grow that together. So it's more of a collaborative relationship than it was in the past.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, we were mentioning it just before we hit record, but I think Max's deal that he signed after winning the title in 21 was through to 28. I remember at the time it was like, whoa, that's an enormous deal. And I think that's changed the whole face of this driver market, because that locked, like you said, I think franchise player is such a good way of putting it. It's like, Michael Jordan. You think of Michael Jordan, you think of the Bulls. He stayed there most of his career. Pat Mahomes is a great example as well. Brady, I know he moved at the end to the greatest team on earth. But he stayed he stayed at the Patriots for most of his career, and it is bizarre to see that in Formula One. And I think the other thing that's strange is that even I was thinking back to sort of 10, 15 years ago, because to begin with, I thought maybe this is a byproduct of, I am a firm believer in that this is probably, in the modern era, this is the most talent we've had packed onto the Formula One grid for a long time. if you look at it,
Oh, that's a good point.
if you write the names down, you've always got names that you're like, they probably don't need to be in Formula One, towards the bottom end of that list. But I would say there's about 10 drivers on the grid right now who you're like, these guys are top quality. You're really, really great drivers. And I don't know if Formula One's always been that blessed with this much talent. And yet, with that happening, some teams are acting like there's only a handful of drivers that have that talent. Do you know what I mean? Like, it feels like the reaction is the opposite to what you'd expect. You expect a team like McLaren to say, all right, you don't want to sign a one-year deal? That's fine. We'll go get Albon. We'll go get Sainz. We'll bring Sainz back. We'll go and see if Lewis wants to come back to McLaren. There's so many layers. Or like Gasly, Ocon. Like, we'll go get one of those guys. They're 2 race winners. We can go get them. And I feel like it is strange. It's almost like this this golden generation of talent. I feel like a bunch of them could finish their careers and look back and be like, man, I just never had a chance to win or win titles because they're going to be forced into locking themselves down. If you look at Red Bull, they've got Verstappen. Ferrari have Leclerc, like you mentioned. Mercedes have Lewis and George on shorter deals, but I think if both of those want to stay, I think they will. I think that Toto Wolff sees that team as it's those 2 guys until Lewis quits, basically. And McLaren have tied down Piastri and Lando. So you look what's left. Aston Martin, let's be honest, Lance Stroll has a contract until he doesn't want to race anymore. I don't see any situation where he doesn't race there. Fernando Alonso is in a contract year, but I think if that team's good, he'll say, okay, sign me up. Take me through to 26. Yeah. Like, what's he got to lose at this point? So that's 5 teams where, boom, not really many options. Alpine, you've got Ocon, who I think is a more natural fit of that team. He's been there a while. Gasly might want to stay there. He's out of the Red Bull program. You've got a guy like Albon who wants to get out of Williams and move up the grid. But you look at it and you're like, well, unless he goes back to Red Bull, and we talked about the merits and the demerits of being Verstappen's teammate, where do you go in the short term? So I think that it is really strange. And even 10, 15 years ago, when you had Lewis, Fernando and Vettel all all at that point when 2010, all those guys were going together. I remember they were all on 2-year deals. It was all, oh well, what's this guy going to do a year and a bit from now because he's not signed a new contract yet. And so even then, it wasn't like it is today. And I think that Verstappen deal was I think it had been slowly changing. Like we've seen, Lewis has always signed like a 2-year deal, for example. Like that's always been his thing. It's like 2 years, 2 years, 2 years. And I've actually thought that's quite a smart way to do it. But Max, for these younger drivers as well, that's just completely changed the whole complexion of it. And hard to see that changing because the reaction is you then have to sign a long deal yourself. And then that means the next guy signs a long deal and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I think that could be a trend we see. And again, to go back to Sainz, sorry, I'm going around about here a little way. That could be another argument in Sainz's head for being like, let's just go to Audi. Go to Audi, get yourself a 6-year deal there. That might not be possible, right? But go there and say, I want a long deal. I want 4 years here. And if they are the winning team, you're locked in. You're locked in and you're like, this is great.
Yeah.
No one's going to come in and, obviously another driver could come in and be my teammate, but I'm secure here for the foreseeable future. So, it's going to be really interesting to see how it all unfolds in the next couple of seasons. I'm going to give you your podcast
Eric
back
Van
now,
Haren
Tim.
on here.
Because that was long, and I managed to get a Tampa Bay Buccaneers plug in there as well, so I'm happy.
No, you got to do what you got to do, man. I totally understand. Thanks very much so far for for your time. I had Eric Van Haren on here last week, and we were talking about the
love Eric. Good guy.
Yeah, he's great, man. He's great. We were talking about the Visa Cash App RB Formula One team, and we were talking about the name, and he had said like, hey, the announcers are going to be like saying this name, and a lap will already will be completed. I posted a tweet earlier today about some technical engineering and some trackside assistants they had hired onto their team recently, and I put that tweet out, and I almost wrote Scuderia AlphaTauri, and then I was like, oh shit!
It took me a year to stop calling them Toro Rosso in 2020. It took me a year to get that out of my system. So AlphaTauri is going to be difficult.
I get a text from a friend of mine, and they're like, what the hell is with this name, man? They're just like, I can't. I guess I can't, and I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, my buddy Nate Saunders, He's thinking this could be called V-Carb F1 team. Dude, what are you hearing? What do you think this thing's going to be called?
Well, I think V-Carb will be it. I think that is what internally they're calling it. So I've been trying to kind of get to the bottom of this story for a while now. And this name we heard a little bit was thrown around. This Racing Bulls idea was thrown around for quite a long time. And I think it was only until about a week before the announcement they dropped that completely. People thought that RB would stand for Racing Bulls, but that phrase, those two words have not been in any press release. And I was told categorically, it's not Racing Bulls. We don't want anyone calling us Racing Bulls. It's not the team name. So I think that's one of the biggest issues with the team is that they've kind of forced you into calling it Visa Cash App because you can't call it RB because it's a bit too similar to Red Bull. And what does RB mean? RB is just an acronym. But internally, when they're talking about this, when they've been throwing it about, they've called it VCARB. And when someone told me that on the phone, they said, "Oh, we're calling it VCARB." It didn't initially click in my head that it was the acronym. And I was saying, I said back like, "Sorry, did you say VCAR?" Because I hadn't. It just took me a second to click. Like, oh, that's Visa Cash App Red Bull. Or sorry, not Visa Cash App Red Bull. Visa Cash App RB. In an acronym. So I think that. I mean, unless we hear otherwise, there may well be something else they want to call it. It'll be interesting. I'm actually quite looking forward to seeing Ricciardo and Tsunoda talk about the team name because I think those two guys, if you're going to have a terrible team name, those are the drivers you want to have to kind of make fun of a name and just kind of, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like the best way for Red Bull now to go forward with this is to acknowledge everyone hates the name, acknowledge it's an awful name, and just let those two guys have fun with it. But I think VCARB, I'd be 100%. Surprised if it was anything else because VCARB, I think one of the reasons they didn't give it a secondary name is because it would kind of bury the Visa Cash App thing. People would just be like, "Oh, we'll call it that." Whereas really, VCARB, people say, "Oh, that's terrible. What does that mean?" And you say, "Well, sorry, it stands for Visa Cash App RB." So it kind of means that the team name is still that, even if you're not quite calling it. So, but it's awful. I mean, it's worse even than the Sauber team name. The kick because at least with that you can call them Sauber if you want to. Sauber still means something. Yes. It's still wrapped up in history. But yeah, I absolutely hate it. And it's you mentioned franchises earlier. Like it feels a little bit hollow, doesn't it? It feels like, okay, well, what is the identity of this team now?
Exactly.
Yeah. So VCARB it is, I think, but hard to get excited by that. Just in any way.
Miss the old Toro Rosso days, man.
Yeah, it makes you realize what you had, man, when it was just the Italian version of Red Bull. I told a friend of mine once, I'll never forget, I told 100%. A friend of mine, I said, Toro Rosso is just Italian for Red Bull. And he looked at me and he was like, what? And I said, yes, Toro Rosso is Red Bull in Italian. And it looked like I'd blown his mind. He was like, what on earth? Like, and, but yeah, it was simple. And once you knew that story, you're like, oh, okay, it's Toro Rosso. They're based in Italy. It's operated there. Like, of course it's that. And then AlphaTauri I didn't like so much, but I thought it's still a brand. It's still a Red Bull owned brand. It's still part of their thing. And I think just finally on the Visa Cash App rant that I think needs to be said is one thing I think we're going to hear a lot of, because I've heard it a bit when I've talked to people at Red Bull, is this kind of idea that Visa and Cash App coming into F1 is this disruptive partnership. It's like they're disruptive, they're hip, they're cool, like all this stuff. And I did say back to those people, I said, no, you're confusing those guys with Red Bull. That is what you guys were when you came into Formula One, and it's what you still are. Like you do things differently from a marketing point of view. When you came into Formula One, you did upset the established order. You completely changed the way Formula One is. You won championships, you bought two teams, you brought in some of the best drivers in the sport have come through Red Bull. Visa and Cash App are in no way disruptive or different. They're paying a lot of money for that deal. Like, so fair play, they, whatever, the merits of the business deal are great. But that messaging, it just irked me because it's like, that's not what they are. They're not disruptive. Everyone has no one's like, when you get a Visa out of your pocket, like, oh, what's he going to do with that Visa? That's such an edgy and aloof brand. Like, I hope he's okay. Whereas Red Bull always had that kind of that cool and underground kind of feel to it. And even today, Red Bull has cultivated that image of just being different and being, they've got X Games, for example. They've got the Red Bull Air Race. They've got all these different things that no one else does. Visa and Cash App, I think, personally, are so far away from what Red Bull stands for that I think that as well kind of just makes it difficult to get on board with. If Red Bull had done this with another random company, but it was a genuinely disruptive and a genuinely kind of left field company that did things all completely differently to everyone else, you think, okay, I can see where the symmetry here is. I can see where one thing led to the next. And I didn't know Dietrich Mateschitz at all. Like, never really, I think I spoke to him once, like when I saw him at a race. Yeah. Obviously passed away a couple of years ago. It's hard to imagine a guy like that would have been happy seeing that team renamed like that. Like, I'm not saying he would have been, because I don't know, but the fact that he never changed the name to that while he was alive or did any kind of deal like it suggests he wouldn't have liked it. So I don't know. It just, the whole thing kind of leaves a bit of a sour taste for me, and it's just hard to get away from that, really. So
yeah, it is. I mean, I would have I wouldn't have minded like Racing Bulls, or if they reverted back to Toro Rosso or something like that, like go back to the go back to the genesis of the team. I mean, I'm cool with that. I mean, that was a great name, and I hated it when they left Toro Rosso to become Alpha Tauri and all these other. I didn't like it at all. I appreciated what we had, like you had said, when we had it. So,
and I think that when the Racing Bulls name came out, I think that was quite purposefully leaked last year. Like, it got out into the media, and the reaction to it was similar to what the reaction has been to Visa Cash App RB. But if you'd given people a choice and said, do you want it to be called something Racing Bulls or Visa Cash App RB, if those are the only two options, you take Racing Bulls, because at least it sounds like a racing brand. At least it sounds like something. So yeah, we didn't know how good we had it with Racing Bulls, did we, Tim? We just didn't know. We had it right there, and
yeah, like it was interesting. Like Nate, like Eric had said something that was really, I didn't really kick in, because like Red Bull is actually Oracle Red Bull, and like we don't really, we don't say Oracle Red Bull Racing Team, right? We just don't do it. We just say Red Bull Racing or Red Bull or the Red Bulls, and it's like he said, for this, it's like you don't have that. You can't, like, there is no way around. Any of it. Exactly. Like, you have to say Visa Cash App RPT.
Because I think that's what Visa and Cash App realized. Yeah, Visa and Cash App clearly realized that. Like, so I mean, and you look at MoneyGram had that big deal with Haas. You never call them MoneyGram Haas, and all the teams have that kind of deal. So from a business point of view, I think Visa and Cash App have been really smart about this, because there's like you said, there is just no way you can call them anything else. And VCARB is it's just kind of a bad solution to a really awful name, but it means that they're always going to be front and center, and no one can be like, oh no, okay, but it is Visa Cash App, but it's actually Visa Cash App Toro Rosso, because everyone would love to call it Toro Rosso again. And even if fans might start doing it, it's like, well, that's not actually the name, so you can't just start calling it Toro Rosso. Like, if that was the case, I'd be calling, I'd go and be like, well, the Jordan's doing well on the grid today, because always loved the Jordan, racing, down the way. So yeah, a bit unedifying altogether, but it'll be interesting. I think it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Before you go, quick thought on, what do you think this season's going to be like? We're coming into.
So I've been a bit pessimistic on all the pods I've done. I say all the pods I've done. I've done one other podcast, Tim. So you're still in special company, listening to me just rant at you for 40 minutes.
You're going to listen to me talk, okay? So shut up and listen to me talk. This is my time
now. I have a strong feeling that we're bubbling towards a really, really good moment like we had in 2021. But I don't think that's this year. I think that's 2025. I think naturally, because of 26, Red Bull are going to be like, is there any, and we saw it with Mercedes, right? Is there much point in us developing this car when it's so far ahead? Let's try and get a jump start. Where some of those other chasing teams are going to be like, well, let's keep pushing, because we could catch those guys in 2025. And hopefully this year, I think Max is going to win a ton of races this year, to be honest with you, because he's just on a different level at the moment. I mean, his confidence, his ability, and that team, that cut, and the team has Red Bull has been performing so well just across the board, strategies, pit stops, everything, development, etc. Hard to see that in the space of an off season completely changing. So I think that Max is going to have it his own way in terms of the championship. I just think that. But I think that what will make the season will be if we have more than one race where somebody else wins other than Red Bull, and hopefully we can see at least one or more of McLaren, Mercedes, Aston win as well as Ferrari, and maybe towards the end of the year we get to see that. But yeah, I'm just holding fire on all my optimism because I think that it's just so difficult to predict anything else. Maybe you feel differently, but we've never seen a season like we saw last year with Max, and
never.
Yeah, for that to cool off so quickly without there being any change to the regulations at this point. There's been nothing, and when you look at 2020 to 2021, there was a few little changes, wasn't there, to the cars that did help Red Bull, use those changes to kind of get that little bit closer that they needed. And what we ended up getting was an incredible season. We don't really have that level of this year. So I know it's not the sexiest prediction to make, but I just think we're going to have more of the same. But hopefully what we're seeing is the foundations being laid for a really, really close 25. So kind of a on the fence answer, but I think Max wins a lot. But then hopefully we get our reward in 2025. But what do you think? I mean, do you think I'm being needlessly pessimistic, or do you think that's about right?
No, I think I don't see it. I think we get closer racing. I think we get different winners. I think we get the same champion. I think we get I think Max gets the championship, but I think that he'll be pushed a little bit more than he was obviously last season. That's simply the way I look at it, just because how fast some of these teams were able to turn their cars around in season. And now they've had the winter months. They've got a really good stretch of time to really buckle in and nail down 2024 car and look into the future as well. And so that's why I think that we'll probably get something a little bit closer. I think McLaren's going to make a step. I think I'm interested to see what Mercedes does, man. I think it all just rests on those two, and maybe Aston Martin and Ferrari. But I just look at what's Mercedes up to. Because they've got it. This is their turnaround. They've got to turn everything around, man. And if it doesn't work this season, man.
I mean,
and Total Wolf, James Allison, signing those deals as well.
Well, yeah, and again, we were talking about longevity. I mean, Mercedes and Red Bull have been the two teams on the personnel side that have done that really well. But yeah, I think no, you're spot on, and it's kind of amazing, isn't it? How quickly we've got used to Mercedes not winning. Because a few years ago, they were doing what I was just saying Red Bull are doing, winning all the time. And just the idea of them not winning a single race in the season was completely baffling. So, yeah, I think out of all the teams, and as well, I mean, I know Lewis divides a lot of opinion, but Lewis Hamilton's such a compelling character to have in Formula One. He's just, as a talent, he's one of the best that we've seen in a long time. He's like Fernando Alonso in that sense. You're just always drawn to what him and his teams are doing. And so I think if they can get that right, because I think Max v Lewis was special. It was something we were so privileged to see that play out. It was annoying the way it ended with a cloud over it. But if we can get anything close to that, I think we'll be in great shape. But what was it he said last year? It was we need the best 6 months development ever to just to get close to Red Bull. So we'll see. I mean, Bahrain. I think everyone's going to be looking at that. I think Mercedes probably going to be the one everyone's looking at, because I think deep down everyone still thinks Mercedes, if they get it all right, I think you're spot on. They're the guys that should take the fight to Red Bull. But we could be wrong. I mean, McLaren look good. Ferrari might surprise us, but we've said that before. But yeah, I actually think Aston will drop off though. I don't know if you think otherwise, but I think
really?
Aston, I think they did great last year, and I loved the story, but I don't know. I think that there might be a bit of a hangover from that this year. They've moved into that new, that whole new facility. I don't know. I just think those other teams, it seemed like they'd got their heads in the right place by kind of mid-season last year, and you saw the situation start to change. And yeah, but we'll see. I mean, I've been wrong. I've been very wrong on preseason predictions before. So hopefully this is a case of me being completely wrong across the board. Because if that is the case, then we're going to have a very good season.
Nate, thanks so much for taking the time to do this, man. I really appreciate it. Let everybody
thanks for
know
listening
where they
to me.
can follow you. And dude, I love listening to you, man. I listen to you for an hour straight anytime, buddy. You know that.
I appreciate it, dude.
Let everybody know where they can find your work and where they can follow you on social media.
Yep. So I don't just talk; I write for a living as well. So if you want to read, you can read it in my voice if you want. I write on ESPN.com/Formula One. So all of our F1 news basically is there. I'm on the ESPN Unlapped podcast with Katie George and Lawrence Edmondson, and I do a podcast with Lawrence Barretto and Chris Medland called The Paddock, which is a bit more, lighthearted, tongue-in-cheek stories from the paddock, but they're both Formula One. So, as you can tell, I love the sound of my own voice because I'm on two pods, and I've basically hijacked Tim's podcast here. So, so yeah. But no, mate, I love this pod. It's great. It's great to come on, and I'm psyched that you're coming to more races this year. That's awesome news. So,
yeah, man.
Yeah.
I'm really excited. I look forward to seeing you and Lawrence in Bahrain. Dude, thanks very much for taking the time to do this. Really appreciate it. I'm Tim Hauraney. If you want more Nailing the Apex, you can get it wherever you get your podcasts. You can watch past episodes on YouTube as well. We'll be back on Thursday with another new episode. So till then, we'll talk to you all later.